Hello, I'm Angie Hobbs and I'm the Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy at the University of Sheffield. And I want to explore why we should study Aristotle's virtue ethics at all in the 21st century. Here is Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. Here we've got a Roman copy in marble of a wonderful Greek bronze bust of him by Lysippos. It's very dapper. He was apparently a very natty dresser, always very well turned out. Now, Aristotle divides the sciences into three. By sciences, I really mean all intellectual disciplines: theoretical, productive, and practical. He classes the study of ethics as a practical science, along with the study of politics. The practical sciences aim at telling us how to live. Ethics explores how we should live as individuals, and politics how we should live in communities. His approach to ethics is therefore agent-centred. It is at least capable of taking on board the complexities of the lived human experience. Although there are many interconnections, it differs from act-centred ethical theories based on notions of duties and rights, for instance Kant, or of utilitarian consequences, such as Bentham and Mill. Aristotle claims that our actions aim at the human good, and that this is eudaimonia in the Greek, flourishing. I mean, it literally means blessed by a benevolent guardian spirit. But what is eudaimonia? What is flourishing? We're told it is, I quote, an activity of the psyche, the soul, in accordance with excellence. That's in Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7. Now, psyche does not here imply an immortal soul, but simply refers to the animating force, whatever it is that makes us alive. In fact, Aristotle does not believe that humans have an immortal soul. Many ancient Greek philosophers did, but Aristotle doesn't. Aristotle is saying that human flourishing consists in the excellent use of our faculties, the excellent fulfilment of our human potential. So eudaimonia is thus a more objective concept than our happiness, and personally I find this very helpful, because we all experience times when we cannot be happy. And happiness might not even be an appropriate or sensitive response, for example, in the wake of a huge natural disaster, maybe at certain particularly grim moments during the pandemic. But we can always try to flourish in the sense of making the best use of our faculties, at least within the constraints of our current circumstances. Aristotle does add in Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 10, that we do need a few basic external goods in order to flourish, in addition to our own excellent activity. He's also clear in 110 that we need to consider the whole of a life when considering questions of flourishing. His ethical approach therefore invites us to consider the shape and narrative of a well-lived life. And there are, I think, very interesting links between an ethics of flourishing and virtue and aesthetics, links which become more visible, I think, if we read Aristotle's Poetics. It's only by reflecting on the narrative as a whole that we can appreciate what a flourishing or stunted or warped life might look like. So despite the proviso in Book 1, Chapter 10 about our needing some basic external goods in order to flourish, it remains true that for Aristotle flourishing chiefly consists in excellent activity of the psyche. But what does this excellent activity actually comprise? He makes an important distinction between excellences of character, the ethical virtues, and excellences of intellect, the intellectual virtues. Though we should note that excellences of character still require the intellectual excellence of practical reason, phronesis, in order to make the right ethical choice. But Despite this interweaving of reason and emotion in our ethical choices, there is still a potential tension between the intellectual activity of practical reason, Phronesis, and the intellectual activity of contemplation, theoria. Theoria is the activity of the gods, or God. Aristotle uses both the plural and singular forms. And as mortal humans, we cannot, of course, become immortal gods. We cannot contemplate forever. However, the intriguing question is whether we should try to be inevitably imperfect gods and focus on theoria, or instead concentrate on phronesis and the ethical virtues of a successful human. Or is it in fact part of our human condition to try to exceed our human limitations, or our perceived human limitations? And there have been many attempts to try to resolve this apparent tension. Ackrell, for instance, says that the test of an ethical virtue is whether it helps create a society in which contemplation can best flourish. We're going to come back to that. But even if we decide to focus on living a life of practical wisdom manifest in the ethical virtues, how do we acquire them? We have to start as young children by repeatedly performing good acts, modelled on those of our parents, teachers and neighbours. As we develop, we come to understand why these acts are good, and this understanding will help us grow into good humans with a settled disposition to perform good acts. In other words, there is an important difference between being a human who performs a good act and being a good human who will always perform such an act. Performing the good act comes first chronologically in a person's life, but understanding what counts as a good act requires understanding of what the good human would do in that situation. So the notion of the good human is logically prior. There's therefore no circularity. But what is it to be a good human? Is the concept too vague? Agent-centred ethics, such as Aristotle's, invite us to consider role models. In this respect, they invite us to imagine examples of good humans and their life in some detail. However, the question still arises, how do you define the good human? As we've seen, one possible response is offered by Ackrell. If the intellectual excellence of theoria, contemplation, is the divine element in humans, then the test of the good human might be how their virtues help to create a society in which theoria can flourish. It's an interesting idea, but it is a much disputed question, and I'm not sure Aristotle ever offers us a fully satisfying answer. What is not in dispute is the importance in Aristotle of the social and political context, both for becoming virtuous and for being able to practice the virtues. What social and political conditions are needed for people to develop the ethical and intellectual virtues and thus to flourish? We've seen the importance of role models, of good role models, but they're only going to exist in a well-functioning society. Education is going to be crucial, so crucial that Aristotle thinks it should be a matter of central state concern. Like Plato before him, he pays more attention to education than law in the formation of virtuous behaviour. A social setting is also needed for the exercise of some virtues, such as justice. Other virtues, such as courage, do not always require a social context, but very often do. At the end of the Ethics, Aristotle claims that the study of ethics will naturally lead on to a study of political constitutions. And at the start of his Politics, he declares, famously, that the human is a political animal, by which he means the kind of animal naturally suited to live in a polis, a city-state, in a social setting. One of the most appealing features of the ethics to me is the prominence Aristotle gives to the importance of friendship in the good life. In Ethics Books 8 and 9, we have one of the richest and most penetrating analyses of the different kinds of friendship ever written. Furthermore, Aristotle views circles of friendships as crucial not just in our private lives, but as essential building blocks of the polis, the city-state. We might today have concerns about nepotism and other forms of unmerited preferential treatment, but for Aristotle, friendship is necessary for the fellow-feeling, shared goals and mutual trust that he believes to be vital in any flourishing political community. Another feature of his virtue ethics which I find very attractive is his claim that the truly good human will take pleasure in exercising the virtues, and if they don't, they are not yet truly good. Aristotle does not conceive of a struggle between goodness and pleasure in the way that, for example, Kant sometimes does. For Aristotle, the truly good human finds it easy to be good, delights in being good. Though we should emphasise that it does have to be the right kind of pleasure in the right kind of things. Aristotle is certainly not advocating undiscriminating hedonism. For all these reasons, Aristotle's virtue ethics, I think, has much to offer us, but it also raises serious questions. His argument assumes the existence of a human function, which in turn appears to assume the existence of a human essence. But are there good grounds for such assumptions? What would Darwin say about that, for instance? I explore these issues in my companion discussion of the so-called function argument of Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7. Even more problematic are Aristotle's views, more clearly expressed in the Politics, on women and what he terms natural slaves. Women, he says, possess reasoning ability, but are often too emotional to exercise it. His words, not mine. And some humans, both women and men, he says, do not possess sufficient reasoning ability to direct their own lives well, and are, at least potentially, better off if more intelligent men direct their lives for them. Such humans are natural slaves. Again, his words, not mine. Now, such views are, of course, utterly false and quite rightly morally repugnant to us. So the question is, can the framework of Aristotle's virtue ethics withstand the removal of such false and repugnant claims? And the good news is that I think it can. I think that his views on the relationship between flourishing and virtue can simply be applied to all humans. As we have seen, there will still be problems, particularly with regard to the notion of a human essence and the relation between practical wisdom, Phronesis, and contemplation, theoria. But overall, I believe his rich ethical theory still has much to teach us. I believe it is a theory that can be fruitfully reworked for the 21st century. Thank you so much, and the very best of luck with whatever you do next.